Hello, my name is Karina Ricker. I am the Reference and Government Information Librarian here at the University at Albany. Welcome to this installment of Librarians with Lattes, a podcast dedicated to being informed, reading, and staying caffeinated. Our guest today is Brian Keogh, head of the M.E. Grenander Department of Special Collections and Archives here at the university. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you for having me, Karina.
Now, Brian, you might not have known that this was Librarians with Latte, and I notice you don't have a beverage.
I have a club soda.
Okay.
Yes.
Do you think you're caffeinated enough to stay awake for this interview?
I just chugged down 12 ounces of coffee on my way here, so I'm all set.
And I've had chocolate, so we're okay.
Great.
Brian, just to make it clear to our listeners, our department was named for capital M, capital E, Grenander. Who is M.E. Grenander?
Mary Elizabeth Grenander was a faculty member in the English department here at the university for many years. She was a scholar of the writer Ambrose Bierce, one of the national specialists on Ambrose Bierce. And she was also a great supporter of special collections and archives. She, in the early 1990s, she endowed the department with a large gift, and that supports a lot of the things that we're able to do in terms of acquiring collections, in terms of engaging in scholarly activities at conferences and various events, and all sorts of other support for the department and the work that we do.
So that was really a boost for your department.
Absolutely.
Oh, that's
it was
great.
A great gift and keeps on giving.
Wonderful. I have another basic question. What do we mean by a special collection, and what do we mean by archives?
Well, essentially, we have two kinds of materials in the special collections and archives. We have records, or what are commonly referred to as primary sources, and these are materials that are used for research, for interpretation, for people from undergraduates to well-known scholars at other universities to do historical research on some specific topic. The second part of that are books that are either rare because they were published in the early 1500s, are expensive, and they were requested by various teaching faculty on campus, or we actually collect in children's literature. So we have a wonderful collection of historical children's literature collection spanning the 1860s through about 1950 that, again, historians use for research. So really, special collections are specialized book collections, and then the archives are records or primary sources that are used, in both cases, usually for historical research.
And would you say that the collection is more heavy on the record side or the special books?
Yeah, initially when the department was created in the mid-1960s, when we became a research university and we wanted to expand the library, there was actually a librarian who had a budget to buy just rare book materials. So this is how we got most of our 16th and 17th century materials, things that were rare but would also support research by faculty. As we moved on in the 70s and 80s, it was really not something that we could compete with the Harvards or the other private rare book collections, so we started to focus on records. So we collect all of the records that document the history of the university going back to 1844. Then in the late 70s and 1980s, we developed some collecting areas where we went out and identified some underdocumented historical topics and went and worked with individuals and organizations under those subject areas.
I know in academic libraries with our collections, we often collect according to the university curriculum and researchers' needs. So how is collecting, what is your mission like for your department?
Generally, the mission is to collect, organize, and provide access to the types of materials that I was previously referring to. But one of the ways that we support academic programs on campus, we document New York State political history, and that venture into that area was done in part with the Rockefeller College of Public Affairs and Policy. So they had a conference actually in the early 1980s where they brought together a number of former Rockefeller appointees, and they hired a consultant, and he wrote a report suggesting that we develop a political collection documenting New York State's political history. So that's really in the early mid-1980s when we started to reach out to groups like the New York State chapter of the National Organization for Women, the New York State Conservative Party, So now we have dozens of different political groups who are based here in Albany because it's the capital, that we work to preserve their historical records so that researchers and scholars and students will have access to these materials. And we get incredible activity from scholars all over the world accessing not only the political collections, but some of our children's collection.
So tell me more about your subject areas that you've collected in.
So we have the New York State Modern Political Archive, which I alluded to, which seeks to document all aspects of political history. And the way we do that is we work with organizations. We meet with organizations. We meet with individuals who are leaders in various organizations. These could be liberal, conservative, left wing, right wing. And we work to get those records into our department. So that is the New York State Modern Political Archive. We've also worked with the School of Criminal Justice, including Professor Jim Acker, on developing something in the last dozen years or so. It's called the National Death Penalty Archive. So, and this is kind of a way, this is how archivists work, right? So organizations create records in their daily activity. They're useful to the organization for a period of time. Then they become not really valuable to the organization, but really valuable to a historian. So what we do in special collections is try to jump into that gap there and get the records before they're destroyed or thrown out. So I meet weekly with various individuals and organizations.
You have to be really proactive.
Very proactive, yeah. And this is something that's done at various colleges and universities throughout the country, is documenting some geographic or topical area that's pertinent to their region. So obviously being in Albany, politics and government is a big part of the culture here. So we seek to document a significant aspect of that. So the National Death Penalty Archive stretches the scope nationally. So we work with organizations, academics, political activists who are for and against capital punishment. So for example, we have the records of the National Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, which is in Washington, D.C. Leading activists who have testified in Supreme Court cases and have published pioneering work in criminal justice and capital punishment. We have their papers and original research data in the collection. So you can see we emphasize a lot in political history. Another collecting area that was started in that late 70s, early 80s period is what we call the German and Jewish Intellectual Emigre Collection. So in Germany in the 1930s, many academics were forced to leave their university positions, whether because they were outspoken against the Nazis or they happened to be Jewish themselves. So many of these people, thousands of people, came to the United States in the 1930s and 40s. So we had a professor, John Spolak, who did an oral history project, interviewed a lot of these emigres in the 1970s and 80s, and also was able to get their papers from those people. Many influential people, Adolph Lowe, who was an economic advisor to FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt. So it's really interesting. We have correspondence from Adolph Lowe with Eleanor Roosevelt, and so you can see her participation in the policy-making process. She was really one of the first ladies to do that, to be really involved in public policy. So those are some of our main collecting areas. I mentioned the children's literature collection a little earlier too. And most obviously, we document one of the most important historical topics, that is the history of the University at Albany that goes back to 1844. So you can get tons of information about the school in the 19th century, how it changed in the early 20th century, and then how it changed again in the 1960s to where we are today. So we have lots of undergrads and graduate students who research the history of the university. So that's another important area that we document. And we work with the provost office and other administrative offices and student groups to make sure that they're getting their important records to us.
So the archives collection for the university gets a lot of attention.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
I actually teach a class of freshman history and political science majors, and it is structured as a seminar class. And their final paper is to write about some alum of the school. So I give them a list, and they pick a general time period that they're interested in. And then they spend most of the semester learning how to use primary sources. And it's really an art. It's a creative process. You're not just reading what's on the paper. when you do primary source research, you're interpreting those documents, you're looking for bias in the documents. Why was this letter created? Who is the audience? So there's a lot of aspects that go into doing primary source research, and it's a skill that, teenagers through retired people are constantly improving that skill and doing primary source research, and we get to see that whole spectrum of users in our department.
So, are there particular alumni that people are interested in?
Oh, sure. There's in the 19th century, probably one of our most famous alums is Kate Stoneman, class of 1867. Pretty sure. Someone check me on that. And she was the first female lawyer in the state of New York. She was the first woman to pass the bar exam in the state of New York. And she was also an advocate for women's rights. She was a suffragist. And she was involved with various groups in Albany during the late 19th century advocating for women's right to vote. So she's really an important person that our current students get to know a little bit about. There's later in the 20th century, there's Marcia Brown, who is a well-known children's book author and illustrator, one of only 2 people to win the Newberry Library's Caldecott Award 3 times for 3 of her works. We have all of her original artwork from over 30 books that she authored and published. In addition to Emmy Gernander, Marcia Brown, who passed away, she was class of 1940, and she passed away in 2015 and left us a generous, generous gift. All of the royalties of her books that she maintained copyright for are all now transferred to the department. So it's a gift that keeps on growing and growing, and again, to support various initiatives that we do in terms of digitizing collections, acquiring collections, supports a lot of that effort.
I'm glad you brought up digitizing. The impression I'm getting is that much of your collection is in tangible form only, and that researchers would have to come in to look at the materials. But I also know that some of your materials have been digitized and they're actually available through your website. How does a researcher get started on figuring out how they get into the collections?
We have a recent redesign of our website that was done about a year ago, and it's an amazing improvement in terms of showcasing the finding aids, so you can discover which paper records you need to access, but also to showcase more of our digital collection. So one of the ways that we decide, because we're talking about millions and millions of pages, and these are one-of-a-kind unique documents. They can't be scanned in a multiple document feeder. They need to be done one page at a time. So it's very time-consuming. Even it's so time-consuming that we have an outside vendor do it. It's much more cost-effective that way. And we meet at our staff meetings and we prioritize usually based on how much use a collection's getting. So if something's being accessed frequently, we'll move that up in the candidates to be digitized. So one of the things we digitized a few years ago, and we're still trying to complete, is the student newspaper, which is incredibly helpful for researching past students of the university. For example, before we digitized the student newspaper, and it runs from about the 1890s through 1985 right now, we're trying to bridge that gap from 85 to current. But one of the things that we were able to do before the student newspaper was online, we were not aware that Harvey Milk, class of 1951, he wrote dozens of articles and had a column in the student newspaper until we were able to digitize it and make it searchable. So now you go online and you can search Harvey Milk on the student newspapers, and you'll discover that he was a sports enthusiast. He liked politics even when he was an undergraduate. He wrote a regular column about sports and politics on campus. I think there's close to 30 articles that we discovered just by digitizing it. And so the students that each fall semester, my seminar class, they're able to uncover all of these articles where alums are mentioned or where they're writing articles. So it's made the university's history much more discoverable. Probably one of our most used digital collections. It's used by administration. They do a weekly Throwback Thursday, so they're constantly, on a weekly basis searching through the student newspapers.
So just so everybody knows who Harvey Milk is, he was a gay rights activist, and in the 1980s, I believe it was, he was a San Francisco supervisor who was murdered. So that's just a little background on Harvey Milk, but he graduated from our university.
And yeah, he was the first openly gay elected official in the United States,
That's
or one
right.
of the first.
That's right.
Yeah. So, yeah, there's so many alums of the university. I could do 25 more podcasts to talk about all of them. But again, it's wonderful that we have these resources. Even going back to 1844, you can discover that there were 29 students in the class. A lot of normal schools in that period did not admit women. So we were not in the case there. We had 13 women in our first class and 15 men. So it was also an opportunity to provide free opportunities at higher education, which heretofore weren't available unless you came from a family with some sort of economic means. So this was providing first-generation college students the opportunity at higher education has been a tradition at this school since our very first day's opening, and we still continue to do that. So.
Thank you, Brian. I really appreciate you talking with us today. I just find special collections and archives fascinating, and it's always wonderful to be over there, and I do enjoy your new website. And maybe for our listeners, we could say what the address is, and I think it's library.albany.edu/archive.
That's
Did I get
correct.
that
Or
right?
if you Google UAlbany Archive, our page will come up in the first hit. And so I invite everyone to contact us and use our website and let us know if you're interested in any of our collections.
And for our people here on campus, you're in the science library on the 3rd floor.
That's correct.
Great. So I'd like to wrap up our conversation by giving you the chance to tell us what you've been reading and enjoying these days.
Well, I'm reading in preparation for my comprehensive exam to complete the PhD in history. So I'm reading 160 books right now.
Is that all?
One at a time. But just right now, I'm reading Susan Porter Benson's book entitled Countercultures, Saleswomen, Managers, and Customers, 1890 to 1940. And it looks at the rise of department stores in the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it's a women's history, it's a labor history, it's a business history, and it looks at how these women became skilled workers in department store, how they developed their skills in sales and created a real work culture in these department stores. So another opportunity for women to work outside the home. So it's an interesting book. I highly recommend it.
It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
We've been speaking about the university's M.E. Grenander Department of Special Collections and Archives with Department Head Brian Keogh. This is Karina Ricker from the University at Albany Libraries, thanking you for checking out Librarians with Lattes, a podcast dedicated to being informed, reading, and staying caffeinated. Thank you all for listening, and remember to read. Read as if the future depends upon it, because it does. Thank you.